All right. Hi, welcome. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lilie Chouliaraki.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely, it's an honor. We have gosh, I think we will have a really rich conversation about your body of work, and maybe we'll focus a little bit more on the recent themes that you've been working on. But before we dive in, can you introduce yourself and your work for our listeners who might not be familiar with media studies or critical theory to begin with?
Yes, well, I'm a professor at the London School of Economics in the Department of Media and Communications. My work focuses specifically on media ethics. I'm interested in questions that have to do with the communication of vulnerability and suffering,
Mm,
and how we engage with suffering and vulnerability and human pain as spectators through our different screens, from television to social media, but also how we engage with vulnerability and
mm,
suffering as citizens in the kind of political communities we live in.
mm,
The global community and the kind of local, national, regional communities that we feel we belong to.
mm,
And there are, of course, different aspects to vulnerability and suffering and how that is communicated. So my work has focused in the past on how we engage with television news of distant suffering. So how we engage with spectacles of war, spectacles of disaster, and how the narratives that the media tell us,
mm,
one or another way, quite subtly, sometimes not as subtly, many others, regulate or shape
mm,
the orientations that we take towards the suffering that we are witnessing.
mm,
Um, Later work of mine turned to humanitarian communication. So I focus specifically on the NGO sector and how that particular sector, which job is actually to mediate the suffering of distant others, how it does it, like
mm,
um, through humanitarian campaigns, through very often the use of celebrities,
mm.
um, and of course through their presence and commentary and testimonies in the news. So
Mm.
there's enough of that between my first work and a kind of work on
Absolutely. Yeah.
communication. Yeah.
No, go on, go on.
And I just wanted to say that my most recent work again turned stayed with these questions of vulnerability and suffering as a matter of communication, but turned from the question of us, especially as Western spectators in kind of Euro-American contexts, to of other people suffering to our own suffering.
Mm,
So how do we communicate around our pain in
yeah.
our societies? And that's my most recent book called Wronged, which is really a book about political communication
Mm.
because politics and pain, in my view, are two of the key elements of the way in which we understand politics today and in the ways in which we live our culture today.
Congratulations to the achievements that your book has achieved. Yes.
Thank you very
Yes,
much. Thank you.
clearly it's a salient and relevant topic more and more in our world today. I've no doubts that your work is extremely meaningful, both within academia and outside of it. What originally drew you to study how media shapes our responses to human suffering?
I felt that even though images of people suffering everywhere in the world are really quite dominant in our media cultures and have been for many decades, and even though there is a whole field of media and communication studies engaging precisely with the ways mediation works and the ways different narratives
Mm,
kind of shape our relationship to the world. There wasn't really much work done on the politics and the ethics of communicating specifically people who suffer.
Mm.
And to me, that was a bit of a puzzle.
Yeah.
And I thought that that is something that needs to be addressed because not only because I think there is a kind of an imperative uh, to engage and support people who suffer anywhere in the world, but
Mm.
also because I thought that if we want to start being more self-reflexive about how our societies stand and take a position vis-a-vis what's happening in the world, we need to start from the moral and the political question of how do we tell stories
Mm.
about vulnerable others. And I felt that that was not really much of it. There wasn't much of a focus in my discipline,
Yes.
or quite, quite frankly, across the social sciences. Even though
Mm.
in the past maybe 20 years, there has been a turn to vulnerability in different fields of study and research.
Yeah. Before we talk about certain big words, I guess it will be jargon for most people who are not in the industry. Post-humanitarianism, post-humanitarianism, can't even say it right. What does that word mean for the layman in the audience? And you also talked about something called mediated solidarity, which may come in later, but I thought it might be useful to lay the groundwork by first explaining these terms.
Yeah, so part of my work on humanitarian communication was to chart what I believe is a fundamental shift in how we engage with the
Mm.
suffering of distant others. And the way I kind of tried to establish that shift is by examining how solidarity was communicated in the past. And when I say in the past, I mean mid to late 20th century. Versus how it started getting narrated, visualized, and
Yes.
communicated in the 21st century. And quite briefly, I think the older communication of solidarity, the word solidarity itself, was rooted in the idea of a common humanity. So to act in solidarity really meant to feel morally bound to
Mm.
distant others simply because they were fellow human beings.
Yeah.
And so humanitarian campaigns of the late 20th century often appeal to that sense of duty. So they asked us to kind of witness suffering in famine or war zones and to respond with an empathy and often with guilt, given the West's engagement with colonial projects and other imperialist projects. So with empathy and guilt and kind of great emotions of personal emotions of that kind, which were all grounded in the belief that our lives are in some fundamental way interconnected, right?
Mm.
But and here comes the shift that I'm charting. Over the past 15 or 20 years, I believe that humanitarian communication and the word solidarity itself has shifted towards what you just kind of referred to as post-humanitarianism, which is
Mm.
a key term in my work.
Mm.
And here, solidarity is less about moral obligation, a duty towards our common humanity, and more about lifestyle choices.
Mm.
So instead of being framed as a duty to others, something that we carry as a kind of an imperative to help,
Mm.
helping others has become more of a way of expressing who we are.
Yeah.
So it is branded, it is personalized, it is often mediated through the social media, like,
Mm.
actions like liking, retweeting,
Mm.
commenting, following. And it has also entangled with consumer choices, right? So buying a product, for instance, that promises to give back or
Mm.
something like that.
Do you have some
Um,
notable examples that maybe to bring it to life, something that we've all heard of, some bigger
mm,
examples?
for
Paint?
instance, buy a coffee
Yeah, yeah.
that funds projects of clean water, development projects of
Mm.
water, allows us to feel that we've done our bit, that
Yeah,
we are sorry with,
yeah.
this abstraction that's vulnerable others. But I think And it's the same thing with, consuming goods that are being sold in different big NGO websites, T-shirts, bracelets, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Plus, there were also big concerts like, Brand Aid,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, poverty history, etc., etc. We're just buying a ticket and being there and just having that adrenaline rush of a kind of a really kind of successful big rock pop concert actually feels like we are expressing solidarity with other people. And the issue that I have with that is not that people are becoming indifferent through expressions of solidarity like these. On the contrary, I think compassion is everywhere in our culture, if you ask me. But it is compassion, I would say, without the political depth of
Mm,
justice. So the emphasis is now on how we perform solidarity, right? Rather than kind of engaging with narratives of why it is important
mm,
to help the world. What's the
mm,
context?
mm,
Why should I be engaging or supporting or showing solidarity with this cause rather than another? And part of the lack of those narratives now is also that we don't really talk much about structural inequality, historical, systemic power relations.
mm.
We don't learn much of history, and we do not know the relationships of complicity between our world
Yeah.
and 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 what is now known as the global South.
So if I'm hearing you right, it has become very performative, very commodified, as with many other things in our neoliberal, capitalist-driven world.
Yeah,
And, supporting humanitarian uh, initiatives almost become an accessory that we wear, the way we
yeah,
define ourselves. And I guess it's tied into the influencer culture, social media. It's like fast food charity kind of
yeah,
type
completely,
thing.
completely. Yeah, and I should
Mm.
have mentioned that earlier. That one of the case studies I explored in my work on humanitarian communication, it's a book called The Ironic Spectator: Solidarity in the Age of
The
Post-Humanitarianism.
ironic spectator.
Yeah, The Ironic
You might need
Spectator.
to expand on that, but yeah.
I will expand on that. But just to say, one of the case studies is precisely one about a contrast between Audrey Hepburn as one type of, kind of more traditional celebrity advocacy
Yeah.
um, um, practice versus Angelina Jolie, who is a kind of a more
Can
contemporary.
you expand on that? Because, some of our audience might be younger and we may not understand, they may not know what you refer to.
Yeah, so I think, sorry, I think again, it goes back to this idea of what post-humanitarianism expresses as a kind of moral sensibility and as a pedagogy for civil engagement with the world. And I would say that the main difference between those two celebrities is that Audrey Hepburn was very grounded in bigger structures of global governance, like the UN, for instance. She was an ambassador for UNICEF. She always spoke with respect to the organization, articulating very clearly the priorities of the organization, talking about the context and the justifications for why we need to act on certain causes. And she, in a way, despite her, celebrity status, she withdrew her own subjectivity from that communication. She was there, and she was still, that big Hollywood star of the classical era that we all know, but her narrative did not include a big I. And
Mhm.
when we compare that to contemporary celebrities. And of course, I have a lot of respect for Angelina Jolie. I mean, she's been one of the most kind of long-term, sustained, committed UN ambassadors that we have in the 21st century. So that's not a kind of a personal criticism, but I'm talking about the sensibility, the kind of framework of solidarity that we are operating in now today. Her narrative is much more personalized. So there is a kind of meshing or fusion between her personal life, how she conducts herself, her lifestyle choices, adopting her children or giving birth to places like Namibia
Mm,
or just kind of uh, filtering everything that she does as an ambassador
mm,
through her eye. I feel that way. I have had that experience. It makes me want to do that. So there is a focus on the person. There is a focus on our lifestyle choices. And there is also another element to that. It is not so much the um, global governance brand, in this case, the UN, that is at the forefront of the communication, even though, of course, it's always somewhere there. It is the celebrity herself that is at the very heart of that communication. And that's why we see a lot of news stories and social media stories focusing on what, for instance, Angelina Jolie is wearing or who accompanied her in those trips and whether she cried or did not cry, whether she shed a tear or not, rather than really focusing on the cause that she is herself trying to
mm,
communicate.
mm.
And that's exactly what I mean by saying that today's frameworks for solidarity are much more personalized and related to lifestyle rather than a cause
Yeah.
and a structure.
And there are obvious causes to that shift, isn't there? The marketization, the speed of technology, and I guess the collapse of all the religious narratives and all the grand narratives. So everything becomes more about the I, the big I, as you called it. But I'm quite fascinated by the internal stuff, from a more because what I do is I see people and I talk to individual psyche. So I'm quite interested in how would we, I guess we can just be speculating. How might we understand that almost psychodynamically? Was it like an unconscious shield, like a cognitive shield that defends against overwhelming pain almost? Or is there something else that's going on? Is there, why is it that it's if I am not twisting your word, it's a bit like now it's become a bit what's in it for me kind of ethics, a bit performative. Not that it's not genuine, but it's more about what would that do to my image more than a grander global initiative that we all participate in. Do you have some sense of what might be going on for individuals in that whole shift, that
Um,
matrix?
yes, absolutely. I think when we talk about individuals, of course, we talk about um, um, persons and specific selves and subjectivities. But we also need to historicize that, like put it in a context and kind of ask questions about what is the broader sociological, political, cultural environment within which we are all being brought up. And we
Mm,
cannot really separate the inner from the outer in that sense. So, in terms of that shift in solidarity, I would say that it is perhaps less a kind of a deliberate shield, even though there are, of course, discussions about compassion fatigue as we are kind of constantly confronted with images of suffering.
yeah.
And is part of the narrative that's being used by NGOs and journalism itself. But I would say that it is more productive, more useful perhaps to see it less as a deliberate shield and more as a cultural disposition we are gradually socialized into.
Mm,
And again, that has to do with exactly what you mentioned, the marketization of everything, right? So that we live in a neoliberal environment where the self, is incredibly important in all markets. We buy and we sell as individuals with our own kind of authentic sense of who we are. And so that necessarily also filters any collective narratives that we used to perhaps nurture and cultivate in the past about belonging to a community, belonging to a collective, and having values that were bigger than ourselves.
mm,
These narratives are slowly receding, and we're now, as I said, live in a world where the individual takes a prime.
Mm,
And we also live in an environment where technology is also everywhere. And so technology itself invites us to perform those instant kind of low cost gestures of care and kind of engage with different brands, including NGO brands, of course, right? All causes are now in some way branded in the language of markets. And I think these two kind of key elements, the marketization of the self, the ubiquitousness of technology, and I must say another third one is what you call the kind of the recession of grand narratives, the fact
mm,
that there isn't a big politics for all of us now. It is politics has become more individualized,
yeah.
and I think that also has shifted our emotional and ethical orientations towards others, right? Less about collective duty, more about personal expression. And I think the key question, as you put it, is what does this
Mm,
say about me?
mm,
Uh, so yeah, I mean, and if I can say like one final thing about that, I would say the problem with that, one of the problems with that is that compassion itself becomes transactional, right?
mm,
So we just said before, like a coffee that donates a few cents to charity or a hashtag, right? That signals care. That's enough. We
mm.
don't. There's no depth, as I said, to the relationships that we nurture with a broader world. And so, and what stays out of this, of course, is again the bigger questions that consumer societies will never pose, which is what about structural change? What can we do to not only donate to those who suffer, but help reorganize our society so that it minimizes suffering everywhere in the world?
Ah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of systemic impacts. I'm interested in both the systemic impact and the impact on individual psyche. I mean, we know that with the breakdown of grand narratives, the religion institution, and the old big thing that everyone subscribes to, there are more and more instances of existential anxiety because we now need to all choose our own narrative and we need to build our own thing. And people are exposed to too many choices. Um, my work is with a lot of highly gifted, highly intense people, and they often have what we call a kind of moral overexcitabilities, where they deeply feel for global issues or sense of they have a strong sense of justice. A lot of them, there's an innate sensitivity to what's going on in the surrounding, and often they do feel this existential urgency to act. So. But I guess even the initial intention was sincere when they engage with humanitarian causes or stand up for their causes, inevitably they get sucked into this whole capitalist machine we're talking about. And so there's lots of disillusionment, compassion burnout, I think cynicism and despair they're
Yes.
more prone to it. So I'm not sure what I'm watching, but would you have any idea or advice or words that you can say around it? How can they continue to engage in meaningful solidarity without
Well,
being crushed?
yes, yes. I think, well, I deeply recognize that predicament that you're
Mm,
describing right now. And I think that those with heightened sensitivity to injustice, as you put it, often enter humanitarian work with extraordinary
mm.
sincerity and a sense of urgency.
Idealism as well.
Yeah, and a sense of idealism, of course. Um, and of course, that kind of passion in the contemporary environment of marketized, branded NGOs, and not only NGOs, it's the whole global governance system, and of course, state structures that kind of get in the way, so to speak. And we can see what's going on now around the world with the rise of authoritarianism and illiberalism, how the funding and the human resources of that sector are now, completely diminished. So, of course, their passion collides with the realities of that system. And that can lead and does lead to exhaustion and cynicism and despair. I mean, I don't know if I can give any very concrete advice, but I would say I think the first thing is to accept that solidarity today is always entangled with market logics. I don't think we can talk about, the kind of idealized world where people are just coming together in grassroots ways and so in a sustained kind of informed and efficient way, try for in the long term to change the circumstances of vulnerable people. So there's always a market logic in any form of organizing, institution, sector. Um, but to resist that entanglement doesn't necessarily mean withdrawing altogether from it. I think it's more a question of how to navigate it critically. And it's the same thing, for instance, with universities. Universities are themselves marketized, and
Yes.
they are more and more setting boundaries around what can be researched, whether it takes funding, is there any use to humanities and critical social
You should
sciences.
write your next book on that.
Sorry?
You should write your next book on that. That's a huge
No, I
topic.
know, I know. I mean, a lot of very good people have already written about that, but
Mm,
it is something that concerns me enormously. And what do we do? Do we withdraw from that space altogether? Do we take the kind of idealism and the kind of good ideas and the our sense of solidarity that's not completely alienated in that system with us outside that kind of institutional
mm,
those institutional structures and their market logics? I don't think so. I think
mm.
we just need to learn to navigate those spaces, as I said, and cultivate within them pockets or smaller spaces, no matter how small, in fact, where
Yeah.
solidarity is practiced as a collective ethic, still as a collective ethic, rather than as, the consumer gestures I was mentioning
Yeah.
before. So that can be through grassroots groups, local mutual aid networks, creative collaborations that keep their focus firmly on what we fundamentally believe in, what
Mm,
relationships we want to cultivate and project out there in the world, and a sense of shared responsibility, right? That we are not metrics. We don't want to be part of metrics, but we are people who are dedicated to a cause with a vision of true compassion and a solidarity that requires that society changes for the better.
This might be a bit of a question from the left field. If someone is, let's say they, well, old or young, but let's say they haven't done much in the field, would you encourage them to join in big humanitarian organizations still, or would you encourage them to start something grassroots and creative?
I think both are options. It depends on each person's, kind of individual circumstances, styles of work,
Yeah.
ambition and personal strength. And I would say here that we also need to, in making those decisions, it's not only about what we offer to society, but it is also, and so, kind of externalizing and offering compassion
Mm,
at a large scale, but it is also about practicing self-compassion, right? It's about knowing that moral intensity that comes with engagement with that kind of work is not only a gift to others, but it can be also a burden to us, right? And so to sustain it, we must also give to ourselves permission to pause, to make very, kind of cautious choices about which environment is best for us,
mm,
what would work best. Not everybody can start a grassroots organization in terms of, the resources that are needed there, the networks that they have, the symbolic or moral authority that they feel that they carry. And if you cannot do that, then I think still joining, kind of big, credible NGOs is a choice, is a good choice. A lot of my students are coming from that sector and are going back to that sector, and I encourage them to do that because despite those dominant trends, as I said, there can still be pockets that can generate change. And I also think in a kind of the longer term, um, change comes from within.
Mhm.
We cannot just abstain. We cannot just criticize from outside. We need to be able to fight
Yeah.
and give our battles within those institutions, always in a framework of self-compassion, right? Solidarity is not, it's not a sprint, it's a practice of endurance, both for others and for us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also about finding what feels authentic to the person.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's turn to your more recent work, loaded with wonderful book title, and the book itself, of course, Wrong. What a provocative title. It's pretty wonderfully named. And so on victimhood, it has become a powerful and seductive tool, as you said, in modern politics. Why is claiming victimhood such a potent strategy for the privileged, as you said?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think for me, victimhood has indeed become one of the most powerful currencies in today's politics because it carries both vulnerability and authority. So to say that I am a victim is to present oneself primarily as open to violence
Mm,
rather than capable to inflict violence. And so as morally beyond reproach. And we see that in conversations both within nation states and in the global scene, where those who claim victimhood do not, cannot, um, at the same time admit responsibility for being perpetrators of others. So you're either a victim or you're not. So that structure of victimhood, of carrying both vulnerability and authority, treats being a victim as a zero-sum game.
mm. Can
And
you give
so
us
I
an
think
example to bring it home?
there's two examples. I think one of the main examples from contemporary politics is, of course, what is going on right now in Gaza,
Mm,
where we see an exterminationist war being waged by Israel on the grounds that Israel is itself a victim of Hamas, and I think most of us would agree to that the October 7th attack
mm,
was a horrific atrocity and a crime against humanity. But at the same time, we can also see that the victimhood of Israel has now turned into a horrific perpetratorship. And I don't want to get into, kind of more detailed conversation over this, even though we see that being played out on our screens and on social media and political discourse and et cetera, et cetera. But I think this is one of the most tragic, and I would say, at the moment, outrageous examples of how claiming victimhood can actually turn a political national power into a genocidal perpetrator.
mm. Yeah. Heavy. I don't know how you do this work 24/7. It just involves so many heavy subjects. Um, how do you protect your own energy as you engage with these heavy topics?
Well, as I don't know if you had the chance to read the introduction of Wronged, but I felt that it was the first time in my whole kind of trajectory as an author where I reveal something more personal about my own circumstances while I was writing that book, and it basically says that my authorial voice is actually grounded in my personal experience as a clinically vulnerable person that went through quite a lot during the COVID pandemic. And one of the things that I experienced during being very sick during the pandemic was I saw other people's vulnerabilities in the hospitals of the UK, where the system almost collapsed under
Yeah.
the enormous demands of those who got sick with very little, because again, neoliberal marketization of university
Mm,
of hospitals and kind of long-term erosion of the infrastructures of the system, and just seeing those people who were already being vulnerable kind of suffering to the extent that I did, and then listening to our politicians, and
mm,
at the time it was a
mm,
conservative, illiberal actually government that was in power, talking about themselves as victims. I thought this is politically outrageous and morally unacceptable. This is what reverse victimization is.
yeah.
This is what far right leaders do. They
Mm,
claim victim for themselves because they have the power to do it, because they have the symbolic resources to be heard and to be believed by many people, and that only hurts those who are already marginalized, those who are already vulnerable, even more.
mm, mm. Thank you for sharing that. And you've channeled the anger and resentment and frustration in that experience beautifully into something so meaningful, which I want to come back to because I do want to talk about how artists, writers, academics can transmute their wounds into gifts. Actually, yeah, I'll cycle back to that because you pulled up quite a few threads that I want to jump on. Reverse victimization. It's
Yeah.
painful to witness. And sometimes it does haunt us with this big sense of powerlessness. Mm.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
personal
Sorry.
experience. So, you want to go on?
Yeah, just wanted to say that the reverse victimization is how privileged victimhood works, right? Because it kind of flips the moral script.
Mm,
And
mm,
instead of solidarity with the powerless, it becomes a weapon to defend power. And I think that's why I was saying earlier that victimhood is about vulnerability and authority. It's about vulnerability and power. So
and
if you have the
Iron,
power,
go on.
yeah, sorry.
No, no, sorry, you go. I keep interrupting.
Yeah, no, no, it's just if you have the power to claim victimhood, you will be heard, you will be believed, but the question is not whether you're a victim. The question is, are you vulnerable, and
Mm,
how are you vulnerable,
mm,
and what can you do about that vulnerability?
yeah. And the irony is because they have more resources, that becomes a more powerful machine for that to happen. And it's harder to reverse it, reverse the reverse victimhood because of the power
Yeah,
and the resources involved in it.
precisely.
You
Precisely.
sharing your personal experience ties it closely to what I work with, which is it does seems to me that a lot of the time legitimacy is granted to very obvious, visible pain that can be performed. Well, obviously, there are lots of legitimate suffering in what's visible too, like in wars. But what happens to suffering that's by nature invisible, such as individual mental illness, physical illness, complex trauma, chronic pain, all sorts of invisible disabilities? How do you see that fitting into your body of work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those people who actually suffer from invisible vulnerabilities.
Mm,
And so this is a question I've been asking myself
yes.
repeatedly. Um, but, I think you're absolutely right that visibility is crucial to to suffering. And this is because in order to honor the legitimacy of our wounds, people need to see them, and then they need to recognize them. So we need to name them, and we need to perform that
Mm,
vulnerability. And so that's why also in Wronged, I say that victimhood is never, or sorry, vulnerability is never just a fact. it is always invested in a story. It's always invested in a story of victimhood, so to speak.
Mm,
And those stories of victimhood can move in different directions, right? So we can invest our own vulnerability in narratives of defiance and survivorship.
mm,
And that's, a very important and good thing to do.
mm,
But it also has limitations because once people start seeing you as a survivor, right, the vulnerability is already diminished. You can tell stories of empathy.
mm,
Uh, in which case, of course, you invited different kinds of responses, and again, there we need to think about what the implications of that are, and do we want to be seen as people who cannot really generate a different identity, but that of a victim that is being pitied, right? We can kind of invest our vulnerability in narratives of justice. And what does that mean in each case, right? What does it mean for someone who's clinically vulnerable versus, having other kinds of vulnerabilities to claim justice? Justice is defined differently in different contexts, and we need to attend to that as well. But I think the crucial thing is that a lot of people with in the public sphere, invest their vulnerabilities in narratives of hate and resentment and enmity. And I think this is really a route that we are seeing more and more in our politics today. And I would say, again, there we need to be both critical and very self-reflexive about why invest
mm,
vulnerability with negative emotion. What do we gain from that? But also, I think more importantly, what does our society lose?
mm.
What's the cost for us personally, and what does our society lose by talking about vulnerability and kind of in those terms. So I think the task in general is to kind of choose narratives that acknowledge our vulnerability and our injury without us, in a way that's self-reflexive, that kind of grapples with the implications of what we are saying for ourselves and for others, and that we acknowledge our injury without being imprisoned by it. Right? Because victim identity is something that we necessarily sometimes carry because, to kind of shout out to the world, you need to to protect us. We need to claim our legal human rights. But other times, being trapped in a victim identity also kind of closes off opportunities
Yeah.
for living life more fully and
Yeah.
sometimes turning into a perpetrator.
So, given the complexity of it, what do you see as the path forward? Is victim a label that we should rehabilitate or abandon entirely?
No, I don't think we should abandon victimhood. I think victimhood, and I don't want to go into this now because it's a kind of a bigger conversation. But as I say in the book, as citizens, particularly of the kind of the global north, because there are such inequalities with the global south that those narratives have not necessarily moved all the way to the global south for reasons of Western power, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say that the languages of victimhood are our historical legacy. So for social movements, for vulnerable groups, for individuals who feel that they have been threatened, done injustice to, or in many ways are marginalized in society, claiming victimhood is important. The question is not about the languages of victimhood themselves. The question is about who claims it. And so we always need to look at the power relations within which victimhood is being articulated and the stories that are invested that invest our victimhood
Mm,
um, in different emotions, as I said, and forms of action. So I would say, yes, victimhood is really important. But we also, with it, need to have this critical conversation about what forms of oppression come with that victimhood.
mm,
Can we name them? Can we do something about it? Can we bring communities, political communities, to recognize them and act on them? Um, So yeah, I think narrative and reflexivity are really key in terms of communicating victimhood in contemporary societies.
Yeah. I think for the individual, the dynamic gets really complex because obviously there's legitimacy that comes with the label and claiming victimhood. And there can be a lot of terror and secondary loss in letting go of that identity. But then, like you said, there's also freedom in letting go of a victim identity.
Yeah,
Mm.
exactly.
There's just no fast answer to that.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
have already been speaking for 45 minutes. Thank you so much for your thoughtful answers. I still have a few questions that some of them can be quite loaded if you still have, 15 minutes or so for us.
Yeah, well, I hope we can
So,
continue the
yeah,
conversation.
good. You know, you talked about the reverse victimhood and how the injustice that is in that. But I am just trying to flip it around and ask, is it possible for someone to be genuinely wounded and simultaneously wielding their wound as a weapon to deflect responsibilities? You know, for those who want to try to hold space for genuine pain, how do we navigate this complexity? Because, for the people that you said earlier, that they could be also genuinely being they could genuinely have been wounded too. So it's just not black or white. Can
No,
Because
not.
we don't
It's not.
want to conversely invalidate their real suffering at the same time, right?
No, I think you're right. And I think, the more we dig into the concept of victimhood and how it is being used, how it has been kind of also historically shaped to come to mean the things that it means now and to come to be claimed by so many different people today, I think the more we realize that really, in order to assess any claim to victimhood that is being made today by individuals or groups, we
Mm,
really need, as I said, to ask the core question, which is not what you are claiming to be, but what is your position in social space. And when I say social space, I don't only mean sociologically, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you belong into this race or another, your sexuality or your class position, of course, whether you're poor or not. I also mean the clinical and different kinds of embodied vulnerabilities that we carry, right? And we all inhabit a continuum of that moves between abject vulnerability, where there are people who just have nothing and are vulnerable in so many ways, and they have been experiencing violence at so many levels of their existence. And then we have absolute privilege, right? Where some people are almost shielded by most forms of vulnerability.
mm,
Of course, there is always embodied vulnerabilities that you can't escape, but we can think of the continuum as two ideal positions, and we are all positioned within that continuum in a crisscross of privileges and vulnerabilities. Some aspects of our existence is shielded from different forms of violence, whether that is physical or social, and other dimensions of our being are actually vulnerable
mm,
uh, whatever forces have, kind of befallen
yeah.
on us. So I think this is maybe a more complex way to
Mm.
understand, the kind of the coupling of
Intersectionality, that we can have
living.
multiple identities.
Yeah, exactly. And how these, are embodied in specific individuals. It takes a bit more time. It takes a little bit more thinking. It takes a bit more emotional investment.
Yeah,
It takes another thing, which is resisting the urge, the almost automatic reflex that's there in our culture to kind of always side with a
yeah,
position of victim and
yeah.
always say, oh, you're a victim, you deserve compassion, you deserve empathy. I would say, no, take a step back and ask why. You know,
Mm,
why is this claim being made now? What are the conditions behind it? Who is this person really? And we can never know, there is a level of obscurity to
mm,
everybody, of course, but there are always, cues that we can follow. There is always a story that we can recover, so to speak, or reconstruct in terms of whether that person is actually speaking out as part of an oppressed group or a vulnerable group in different ways, or whether that person is actually simply reclaiming power. And that's a gray zone in itself, but the questions need to be asked. So
Mm.
how is pain being mobilized? To what ends, right? And
Yeah.
there's always that delicate balance. So we want to validate injuries when people talk about their victimhood, but we don't do that automatically.
Mm.
Um, I think we need to honor, so to speak, the truth of pain, but at the same time, staying alert to how easily that pain can be turned
Yeah.
outward, right? And sometimes, as you said, to harm others, and sometimes to protect privilege. So, yeah. If
Thank
I
you
may
for
say one more thing
absolutely.
about that. In the book, I use this distinction between victimhood as language, as a speech act, as something we say and communicate, and vulnerability as a condition, is what I referred to earlier, like an embodied and a social condition that has to do with the systems that we inhabit
Mm.
as human beings, right? So, and that's why I come back again and again to the real question, which to me is not who is a victim, but rather who is vulnerable.
Mm. Thank you for moving us towards a more nuanced perspective of reality and also a more systemic view. So it's less so about the individual, but everything, even the identity the wounds we carry and the identity that we carry are all a part of a system. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. If I may say something here, I mean, of course, we are all unique individuals, and my own clinical vulnerabilities are mine alone, right? I carry them in my body. But I think what I'm also trying to say, and I think you've just kind of very eloquently reiterated, is that we are never just that, right?
Mm,
Our bodies are not just biological entities, that we always belong to social space, and our bodies and their vulnerabilities are traversed by different social forces. Being a woman and being maybe a white woman, but also being a migrant and
mm,
perhaps being middle class, all of this shapes how I experience my clinical vulnerabilities
mm.
and how I'm being treated and whether my claims to victimhood are believable or not.
Do you consider yourself a social constructivist in the perspective of viewing things?
I would say mild social constructivist, yes,
Mm,
because I do believe in the irreducibility of the biological in some way.
yeah,
So there are really, bodies there, but how we name them and what power we give to their naming is really, really important. Um, and I don't think we can necessarily separate the two because every time we try to put a label or a title or a name to a biological condition, we are at the same time creating it
yeah,
anew.
yeah. I love that how even your answer to that is nuanced and non-binary, and I love that. Thank you. Final question, which comes back to something that you have done yourself, where you've transmuted your clinical wound into a gift for the academia and for the world. I I wonder how an individual listening to this might start doing that. I would suspect there would be question mark to, oh, would that become a justification in me staying wounded? What if it makes me more married to this victim narrative? But how can we use our intensity, the moral sensitivity, or the wounds as a fuel for creation rather than a script for more destructions and self-victimization and disempowerment?
I don't know. Well, that's a hard question to answer, I think. I think as we
Mm,
said before, and I think that kind of leads nicely from our earlier exchange. I think it is really important to be aware of what claiming victimhood is about.
mhm,
Um, and knowing the limitations and the opportunities
mm.
that using that kind of vocabulary about me and myself and about everybody who does experience vulnerabilities and wants to communicate them, what that use of language, what that story that
Yeah.
is being said does, both
Yeah.
to them as a sense of self and to others.
Mm.
Um, I think one of the important things that we need to be reflexive about is knowing that to present oneself as wounded is to seek legitimacy in any environment that we are in. It is to seek recognition. Sometimes it needs to seek social change. But it can also become a way of silencing others or of causing harm. So for someone, in my kind of intersection of social positions, kind of intersectional status, I think it's really important to use my own voice as a vulnerable individual to illuminate circumstances that I know are shared not only by me, but by other people like me.
Mm.
So create a community around the needs um, and the demands of my community, but at the same time do that in a way that doesn't degrade or even more so silence others and their experiences and um, and experiences of vulnerability, and that I don't, of course, cause harm in anyone. I'm not kind of taking the voice of other people
Mm.
and silencing them by doubting mine. But I'm also aware of the fact that my voice doesn't have the visibility, the authority, the believability of other social and political actors, and that I
Mm.
am myself, as all of us, in a continuous struggle for that kind of communication of our vulnerabilities and the recognition. Not everybody can get recognition in the public sphere. So how we struggle to do that,
Mm.
and who we are fighting against and who we are in solidarity with really matters in that.
Mm. Thank you. That's beautiful. I don't think I have any more questions. Thank you so much for your time and for your thoughtful answers and for your work in the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Amy.
Is
It's
there
been
anything
really.
you want to add?
No, I think we had such a rich discussion. It's been a long time since I was kind of provoked to kind of think so deeply about the work that I have done, and not just the work on victimhood that unfortunately is becoming more and more relevant
Mm.
today.
Mm.
When I was writing that piece of work, it was before Trump came into power, and so I thought that my case studies were historical. And then, as the book was coming out in the market, we got
No.
and everything is now becoming alive again, and that vocabulary is being animated in so many different cruel ways and harms so many people around the world.
Yeah.
And of course,
Yeah.
in the United States, even more so. That um, yeah, I don't know if I can be satisfied that the book came out, or be a bit dismayed by the moment in which we live and which the book captures in some way.
It really has timeless relevance. I mean, a day-to-day example I see is people coming and asking whether or not, for example, they should seek a diagnosis for their mental illness, for example, because a diagnosis is a form of claiming an identity, but it comes with all sorts of implications. We shouldn't immediately associate that with victimhood, but then it does, it's a similar kind of dynamic. There's that. Or, if someone had been abused, whether or not they own the story and let it be aired, or would it protect them more by not? So what I'm trying to say is, no, it's a timeless topic that has evergreen relevance. And yes, unfortunately, more and more so given our political climate.
And also, as you just now mentioned, what happens with mental health and what does it
Mm.
mean to be diagnosed? And that's not exactly a vocabulary of victimhood. Maybe one of the things we didn't really touch on, and I could have, but I didn't, is that one of the kind of insights of the book, I think, is that it discusses victimhood as historical languages of pain that have shaped our societies, particularly in Western modernity. But it is not just one vocabulary. It's not just the word victimhood that signifies the victim, and that we have two main languages to talk about the victim. One is the language of psychoanalysis and mental health, right? So it's the word trauma, I would say, is a kind of a key word there. And then we have another language of the victim, which is the language of human rights, that again talks about forms of injury that can make someone vulnerable, and render them open to different forms of violence, but it doesn't have the same history as trauma. It is
Mhm.
not about psychological harm. It's not about emotional violence and you know, the wounds of the soul, so to speak. But it is more about legal protection. It's about social injury. It's about what happens to us, what forms of vulnerability follow us when we are part of a particular social field.
Mhm.
And we occupy a particular social position that leaves us open to, I don't know, as we said earlier, you know, poverty or racism or
Yeah.
or sexism and misogyny, et cetera, et cetera. So we can talk about the victim as a victim, but we also need to know that there is a range of terms that can be used to signify victimhood, right? I'm traumatized. I feel you traumatized me, right? That's another way of saying you're a victim. Or, you know, social protests about human rights. They are also kind of communicating in public the fact that people are harmed socially in some significant way, and they are collectively coming together to talk about their wounds and to ask for change.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a complex vocabulary. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
but
probably
thank you for bringing that into the conversation. That's certainly relevant. Well, finally, I just saw that Korean version of your book is coming out. How many languages is it in now? Do you know?
Yeah, it is now in three languages. It's Korean, it's Japanese, and it's in Greek, or it's coming out in Japanese and Greek. But yeah, they will have come out by the end of the year. But there is at least three more languages that are, you know, it is being prepared to come out on. But until we have the contract and the final agreements on that, you know, I'd rather not say.
I
But
understand.
definitely.
But
Yeah.
congratulations. It's these are all very, well, Korean, Japanese, but they're rather different cultures. So yeah, we can have another big conversation about what that means, but congratulations nonetheless.
Thank you so much. And maybe that, you know, speaks to the fact that vulnerability and victimhood are conditions and vocabularies that concern everybody, right?
Oh,
I mean, there
absolutely.
are historical differences and, as I said, you know, in divisions, but ultimately, you know, we all feel pain. And
Yes,
pain is used in one or another way in our political conversations and cultural experiences. So it's relevant, right? It's relevant.
absolutely. Well, I'm going to let you go, but thank you so much. And you have a wonderful day, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I will
We'll be
absolutely be in touch when this is released.
absolutely. Thank you so much.
No
Bye bye.
problem. Bye bye.